Good evening. And then there was silence. My name's Roger Newman. I'm chair of the All Saints Fabric Committee. I'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of not only the Friends of All Saints, but also the church and this grand old lady. This old lady's been around for a long time, as you know, about 900 years or so, and it's been a centre of Christian worship and centre of the community probably for all of that time. As you can see, she's changed a bit over the years. She's had a few bits added on, a few bits taken off, probably a new roof and all sorts of bits and pieces done to her. But she's still standing. And back in about 1800, the Victorians decided that they would put a concrete raincoat on it. And recently, following an inspection, quinquennial inspection, it was decided that we had to do something about this building. If left unchanged, it would have deteriorated, and it might not have been here for the next 900 years. So I was then asked to join a small group of people that were going to look at how we were going to do it and manage the process of restoring this church to its former glory. And the first job we did as a team was to choose an architect. And it was out of all that we went through a few of them, but one day this gentleman here turned up. It was quite a sunny afternoon, I think, and for 2 hours he told us about what he could do and what he had done in the past. And when he left, I think we, as a team, had decided that he was the man for the job, and ultimately we appointed him as the architect, and a decision that we've not regretted. John's been there for us. He's guided us through not only the rebuilding process, but he's also helped us along the way with funding for HLF and all the other bits and pieces that are necessary to get this job to the state it is now. So, and I know John is a great enthusiast for church archaeology. I think that's fair to say. And so I will now hand over to John, who will now tell us the wonderful story of All Saints and what we've discovered on this long journey.
Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Usually, the food and drink is served after I've talked. That's to stop you escaping. Unfortunately, now you've all been fed and watered, so I hope you won't disappear if you get bored. Anyway, what I'd like to do tonight is the presentation is in 3 parts. I'm going to tell you what we believed we knew 3 years ago when we did a very similar talk. I'm then going to tell you what we now know. And that's going to include, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid, getting out of your seats and walking around the building. So we're going to have a look around the outside and we're going to have a look around the inside. Or at least you're going to come back to your seats and look at the inside. I'm then going to show you some photographs of the work in progress. The contractor was Pierre Restoration, and the team was very good. A little bit protracted because a little thing called COVID arrived halfway through, but we have got to the end, and I hope you all believe that the church now looks very different and a lot better than it did 3 or 4 years ago. A little bit of background about Patcham. I'm going to start with 1066. In 1066, Patcham is a royal manor owned by King Harold. 1086 is Doomsday, when the new king is surveying what he has now acquired. And I must just get the figures right. There were 163 villagers. There were 45 smallholders. The value of Patcham was £80, which was a lot of money. Ladies, sorry, you didn't count in those figures. Only men, because they were worth something. You can probably triple that number. So the population of Patcham in 1086 was probably around 600 to 800 people. So it was a substantial settlement. But there's one other very important entry in 1086, and it says, a church. That's all you get. It says that there is a church here in 1086. I will try and persuade you that we still have most of that church building standing today, and we'll go through why I think that's the case. A couple of other little facts. Following Doomsday, the De Warrens own the manor. The manor is the estate, passed to the Priory at Lewes by the 14th century, and Archbishop Peckham, who was Archbishop at the end of the 13th century, actually was born in the parish. Well, that's what they think anyway. So Patcham was an important place. Now, standing here 3 years ago, we would have told you the following. You are sitting in a 12th century church, probably. The nave was probably 12th century. The chancel, 14th century. North aisle arrives in 1898 with the vestries, so it's a very modern addition, not quite in living memory, but fairly close. Western tower, possibly, maybe 13th century. In addition, of course, above our head is the wonderful Doom painting uncovered in 1878, if I remember correctly. And it has been dated by various experts to somewhere between 1170 and about 1230. I think general opinion is it's the 1230, or at least the early part of the 13th century is the correct date. Since we were all sitting here 3 years ago, that has been conserved and cleaned by Tom Organ and his team, and it is significantly brighter than it was 3 years ago. You wouldn't believe the dust came off, and all the little flakes of paint have been reattached. And one of the things I really like about it is if you have a look up and you look to the underneath, you can see all the little people doing the conga. They're doing a conga to hell. And they're all kings and bishops, which I think is a rather nice little touch. Us mere mortals, we're going the other way. So it's a little bit of a play by the artist or artists that produced that wonderful painting all those years ago. Well, that was what we all talked about 3 years ago. A lot has happened in 3 years, and we are going to completely rewrite much of the early history of your church. Church architects, there's a lovely phrase, and I will paraphrase Jasper Carrott, that genius of literature from the late 20th century, when he referred to Birmingham City football supporters. You don't become a Birmingham City football supporter, you are born one. And it's the same with church architects or church surveyors, in that very few suddenly decide in their career they're going to be a church architect or church surveyor. You are born. And I must have been a very sad child, but from about the age of 10, 11, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to work with historic buildings and churches. And we really do get stuck into the nitty-gritty. And when I first came here, I very quickly realised that there was something else going on. When we date buildings, we look for certain features. And I want you all to remember the word core, spelt qua. All English words are very silly. Core is a place on the Isle of Wight. If you go there today, fantastic late Victorian, early 20th century monastic building stands there, absolutely bonkers. Built by the monks, designed by one of the monks. Really good beer they make. It's a fantastic place to go and visit. In the 11th century, it was one of the places in southern England where you got good building stone. And it was highly prized, and it was shipped all over southeast England. We get it all the way along the south coast. You get it into London, you get it into Kent. All this stone on this arch, the arch above, is core stone from the Isle of Wight. By 1100, it is not being exported in any significant quantities because it's essentially exhausted. And anyway, the King of England owned more of France than the King of France did. And there's carnstone, which is much better to carve, and you can stick it on a boat and bring it across the channel. And you've got a lot of carnstone here, so we can date that to after 1100. I don't believe these blocks have moved since they were put up. If coarse stone isn't available after 1100, even my tiny brain works out that this arch has not changed in the best part of 1,000 years. You have standing fabric from that church listed in 1086, and it's staring you right in the face. It is the arch behind me. The triple arch arrangement, if you go to Patcham, just up the road, they still have the triple arches. Here the side arches are essentially lost. They're just little niches now from the 19th century. But there's a lot of other coarse stone scattered around the building. The doorway in the north aisle, reset by the Victorians, is all in coarse stone. That was in the north wall where the arcade is, that wall was there in 1898. And there's a lot of other coarse stone. As we go round, we'll have a look at it. My personal feeling, and there are other features that we'll see when we go outside, is that you have, from a church predating 1100, the west wall of the nave, the whole of the south wall, the wall above me and the arch, and about half the chancel. You have about 75% of your 11th century church, and that is quite a remarkable rewrite of the history of the building. We also, to our huge surprise, found that you had a south aisle, and you don't need to be a genius to see two of the three arches still visible in the south wall. No written authority states that there was a south aisle on this church. That was a complete surprise when we started to take the hard renders off the outside and the hard renders on the inside. There was a third arch in the centre. That has been completely stripped away because they have put the current doorway in the south wall of the nave in that position. The south porch, the south wall of the south porch is the south wall of that south aisle. And when we had all the renders off inside, there's a much larger arched opening within which is the arch you enter the church today. So, if we were sitting here in around about 1200, you would have walked into an aisle on the south side as you can walk into an aisle on the north side. Those arches date to around about 1180, 1200, somewhere like that. And they've been cut through the earlier wall. And when we go outside, we will see the evidence for that. We also know that by 1400, the aisle had gone. And there's one excellent piece of dating evidence for that, and that is that window. Medieval architecture is split into architectural styles. We have the Romanesque, which covers the Anglo-Saxon period, and the Norman period, and that ends around about 1170, 1180. We then have a little thing called transitional, which I won't bore you with. We then have the Gothic, which, put it crudely, is the 13th century, between 1200 and 1300. Salisbury Cathedral is a wonderful English Gothic cathedral. The earliest substantial Gothic cathedral in this country is actually the East End at Rochester, which I'm fortunate enough to look after, and that dates to around about 1180 to 1200. You then get a thing called the decorated period of architecture, and let's call that the first two-thirds of the 14th century. And that window dates from that period. It's unlikely to be any later than about 1360, 1370. It is a beautiful example. About 75% of the original window still survives, constructed of Wealden sandstone that's come from north of here, and the entire internal arch still survives. that window has been put in the blocking of that arcade. So we can now date that the aisle wasn't here by, shall we say, 1370. That might tie in quite nicely with the French raids that were going on in the middle of the 14th century. Rottingdean lost its south aisle in the 14th century following a French raid. So it may be that it was lost at that point. People often blame the Black Death. And yes, the population, a third of England disappeared in a matter of a few years, and buildings were partly demolished because they were not needed anymore. To complete the story, you then get, in the 15th century, the perpendicular, and in fact, let me get it right, the central window is actually a perpendicular window reused from the north wall of the original nave. So those are the styles of architecture. You can make your mind up about the Victorian work. It's Gothic-ish. I think we shall leave it like that. We were absolutely staggered when we found that south aisle. It is not often nowadays that you find complete parts of buildings that nobody knew anything about. The ground floor plan of that aisle may well exist outside. If we dug a few holes, that's not inviting you all to get a spade and come here tomorrow morning and start digging holes. You're not allowed to. But somewhere under there probably is the South Aisle foundations for another generation to have a look at. Before we go outside, Western Tower. Western Tower has been described in the various documents as 13th century. That's code for we probably don't know. We're pretty convinced it's in at least 2, if not 3 phases of construction. It was going to be much grander at one point, and I will show you the reasoning for that. We know that it was supported by some substantial pieces, some substantial buttresses, which are there on 18th century and 19th century drawings. We know the top of the tower had a little pitched roof in about 1802, 1810, and then it had a flat roof and a parapet by 1856, and today it's got a little witch's hat, which we think dates from the very end of the 19th century. What I want you to understand is that buildings evolve and change. The only constant is change. And so this building is still here today because it's been changed and adapted to suit how the people at the time wished to use the building. So if we'd sat here 150 years ago, these pews weren't here, you'd have probably had box pews. Sit here 500 years ago, there would have been nothing in the church, probably just empty. There would have been a little screen in here. The only sacred part was to the east. The nave was the general area where we all met. We had our markets, the law courts, everything happened in here. And for all those who don't know, what is the role of communion rails? Come on, hands up, yes? Keep the dogs out of the sanctuary. That is absolutely correct. Archbishop Laud, beginning of the 17th century, decreed that you had to have Laudian rails round the sanctuary to keep animals out. That tells you exactly what a church was like in the early 17th century. I'm sure, though, Andy doesn't want you all to bring your pet dog on Sunday. But nevertheless, that will explain how vibrant a church building was some 400 years ago. Right, I have prattled on enough. What I'm going to ask you to do is we're going to go outside and stand by this big buttress that's on the corner at the junction of the nave and the chancel. You will all hear me. For all those who don't know the bits of the building, big tower on the west end, nave, south porch, chancel, modern buttress, probably 18th century. If we start with the chancel, you can see it's in 2 bits. The western bit is made up of these really big field flints. You know, they're football size. And some of them at 45-degree angles, what we call herringbone work. Herringbone work is a good dating evidence for the 11th century. It's what we call Saxo-Norman. In other words, we don't know if it's Saxons, Normans, Saxons working for Normans. Let's just say it's 11th century. If you go a bit further to the east, the wall is in much smaller flints. The chancel has been doubled in size, probably in the 14th century. And on the corner, big lumps of stones called coins, Q-U, coins in Wealden sandstone. So that's come from the north. So the chancel is in two phases, but the core of it is 11th century. One of the things you've got to remember is that southern English churches are almost always rendered. You would have never seen the flints and the little bits stuck on the outside. Our forefathers were embarrassed because that's all we've got lying around in southern England, and also a render means that you can weather the building. It is, you keep the weather out. Over time the render falls off. If it's not maintained, it then, in the 18th century, people say, oh, look at this wonderful stone underneath, let's expose it. Get to the 19th century and the water's coming in, and somebody says, let's put the render back on. But there's a big change. When this building was first built, we're using lime technology. In other words, the stuff that sticks it together is lime rather than Portland cement. Lime is created by burning limestone, driving off the carbon dioxide. You then and then when you use that lime in a mortar mix and it dries out, oxygen joins the mix to turn it back into limestone. It's called the lime cycle. At the end of the 18th century, they're starting to find new materials. When we took your render off here, there were at least two layers. The lower layer was a thing called Roman cement, which has got nothing to do with the Romans, and it's not cement. But don't worry about that. It's what we call an eminently hydraulic lime. In other words, it can set or carbonate in the absence of oxygen. And it is brilliant stuff. It is so strong that if I got a brick and had some Roman cement and stuck that brick to the wall, I could put 2 meters of bricks on that, sticking them on, and it would stay there. It is that strong. It was used in engineering, particularly dockyards. So it's used heavily in the naval dockyards at Portsmouth, at Chatham, at Sheerness, at Deptford. We then get, from the 1820s, 1830s onwards, another miracle material called Portland cement. Called Portland cement because when it dried it looked like Portland stone. This is not a hydraulic material. It is superheated in kilns, and then when you add water it goes off like a rock. Brilliant stuff. So if you're standing here in 1840 and you've got to spend a week kissing and cuddling your lime mortar, or you've got this new wonder material where you add water, stick it on the wall and it goes off, what are you going to use? You're going to use the new wonder material. The problem is it does not let the building breathe. It is waterproof. So essentially in the 19th century the building was restored in the 1820s, the 1850s, the 1870s, the 1880s, and again in 1964. You are covering it in concrete. That means it cannot breathe. These buildings survive because they soak the water up and the water evaporates out. It's sitting in solid ground. It is damp. There's nothing between us and France. Right across the channel, all the wind and rain batters it, it soaks the water up, it's got to come out again. So if you cover it in a waterproof coat, which has got cracks and leaks in it, the water gets behind the waterproof coat and doesn't come out. What that does, it creates a damp, horrid interior, and it rots the lime mortars. Eventually your building falls apart. That is why we had to get the render off. And there was up to 6 inches in thickness. The thickest was on the porch. Some on the tower of that thickness. It was an immense amount of work to get this render off. In fact, they had to use Kango hammers for quite a lot of it. We used to cut it up with a disc into squares and then prise it off. Remarkably, a lot of the dressings, like the coins and around the windows, have all survived. So we were very lucky. We've now repointed this building in a lime mix. We've used a hydraulic lime because we wanted it to go off, and now it can breathe, so the weather can chuck all the water we like at the building, it'll soak it up, and then the water will just evaporate both outside and inside. We're working with the building, not against it. So we've talked about the chancel, let's talk about the nave. Two surviving bays. One, here you can definitely see where the arch was, very, very clearly. Look to my right, that patch of flint work, big manly flints, field flints. Inside, little flints, with this wonderful 14th century window in Wealden sandstone. What's original? Most of the hood moulding and the tracery, the twiddly bits, that's original. This is modern, this is Bath stone from the West Country that's come in the 19th century, so that's modern. So we can date when that arcade was filled up by that window. That window is mid 14th century. Beautiful example. The bay on the other side, which we'll walk round and see, again, very similar. The porch. All these stones are core stone. That's come from the 11th century church on the site. Your doorway is also in core stone, and if you look very closely, there's little pockets cut in the stone for window ferramenta. It's a recycled window set within a much larger arch which we know exists on the inside. So that is the south wall of the south aisle, the front bit here. So that is how wide your south aisle was. And then in the 14th century they filled in the two sides, but if you get your eye in, there's some big bits of reused stone in here. That's Caen stone from France, and in fact 2 or 3 of them are pink, which usually represents burning. So perhaps the French did make it as far as Patcham in the 14th century. Don't feel too sorry for us, we were doing exactly the same to them. It's a bit like home and away football matches. Any questions? You're all quiet.
What's that bit there?
The buttress, they seem to have got very worried about movement on the building in the post-medieval period, probably the 17th, 18th and early 19th centuries. So they've added a big lean-to buttress with bricks used as the dressing. So you can see some of the ones that we've replaced. So they were clearly worried at some point that that corner was falling off. It's not, but we have a big buttress and we've kept it. There's also a very funny blocked opening here, which we have absolutely no idea what that is. Answers on a postcard, please. It's too high for a door and too low for a window. It's also lined out in brickwork. So we really are quite stumped. This bay here of the nave is better preserved in that you can see where the columns are. So you've got one column here, and you've got the edge of one column there with that lovely little chamfer on it. Those are constructed of Caen stone from France. Not Wealden sandstone, Caen stone from France. That's what makes me think it's late in 12th century into the early 13th century, because that's when we were importing much of this material. And you can just see chalk blocks outlining where the arch is. And then there would be a third arch above where the porch is. This huge great buttress on the corner is a mere shadow of itself when it was first constructed, probably in the early 19th century. it actually came further out, and you can see on the corner of the tower there's a rough bit of masonry before the coin stones on the corner start again. It started about 4 or 5 feet above where it does today and came all the way down to somewhere down here according to the drawings. So obviously they were very worried about movement at some point, and then over the centuries they've sort of cut it back, as it were. Now the tower. You can see quite clearly that the tower is in more than one phase. You can see the bottom bit is slightly wider than the upper part, and it's much more pronounced when you go around the western side. You can see that the bottom is around about that much wider all the way round. And in fact, in 2 places we've got a beautiful carved cornerstone table. So we think you were going to have a rather smart tower with wonderful string courses in bands going up, but they probably didn't get any further than the bottom bit. Ran out of money, who knows. And then the upper bit is made up of bits. So the little round-headed window in the belfry has clearly been recycled from somewhere else. Wheeled sandstone coins on the corner, which suggests 14th century, because we've got 14th century wheeled sandstone on the other corner. And so we think it's just been, when there's been a bit more money, they've added a bit more to the tower. Huge great buttresses added on this corner in the 19th century, presumably because they were worried about movement. It's not going anywhere. But what we did was, they were absolutely solid with concrete. We lost all the brickwork, and we've reinstated the brick dressings on the corners.
So was it originally brick?
Yes, it was brick when it was built, yes. There's one more feature on the outside I would like to show you. I'm not ignoring the 19th century north aisle. For some people that's fabulous architecture, but compared with the earlier work it's not quite as interesting as the earlier parts of the building. What I'm now going to ask you to do is we're going to move round to the other corner of the tower, and I hope you've all got your binoculars with you. Oh dear, you haven't. I'll explain what you're looking at. You can come back another day, because there's a beautiful feature that was hinted at in earlier records, but we managed to uncover it. So if we go around the other side, we'll have a look at it. If you remember 3 years ago, there was a 30-degree big 19th century chimney stack on this corner, which wasn't used anymore, and we took it off. We also took all the concrete off this corner. You have the corner of the medieval nave. All those stone blocks are actually cairn stone, apart from the bottom 1.5, which are core. If you go up, you'll see there's a little horizontal string course by the hopper with 3 little nodules on it. That is a beautiful remnant of a mid-12th century string course in cairn stone. Very high class work, and you can just get your eye in. They're little animal heads. They would have had eyes, sort of a long nose. Beautiful examples at places like Kilpeck in Herefordshire, Barfreston in Kent, Patricksbourne in Kent. You know, there's lots of examples of them. And you had probably on this side of the building a frieze that went the whole length. Beautiful quality, of which we have one little fragment there. We also know that there was a big buttress, because the sloping bit of masonry going up, most of those dressings are cairn stone. You can see the new ones we put in, so that is contemporary with this little bit of carving that's on the end, and we put some lead in over the top to stop the water dripping on it and dissolving it. We're trying to throw the water off. So that is a beautiful little survival of a bit of 12th century work just on this corner. And there's a little hint of that in the peasant description, but no more. So we've uncovered it so you can see it now for the future. You can also see where the chimney stack was, but you can see the soot. That'll take a few decades to wear off, but it will wear off. You will also notice on the corner of the tower you've got core stone blocks there, and then you've got cairnstone above, and can you see a beautiful little carved cornerstone where the tower goes from being slightly bigger, reducing down. That would have been repeated all the way along around, a string course we call it, and you've only got one little bit of it left, or that's as far as they got, who knows. And then that would have been repeated higher up the tower, probably 2 or 3 stories. Any questions?
Why is the 2 little pink tile bits there above that corner?
Right, the question was the 2 little pink tile bits. You can see one's there, you've got actually a brick in there. They're called putt logs. And that is the hole in which a big bit of timber was put, a board balanced between that bit of timber and another bit of timber. That's your medieval scaffolding. So you've built a hole in the wall, you shoved a bit of timber in, there's a brick further along, that's where the next one was. When you get your eye in, you can see a number of them. There's another one up high, another one there. They're about 6 foot height. And so you had a bit of timber in, a plank, you stood on the plank and built the wall. The keys don't fall off. Lady in the back. Right, the windows, they're a mixture of recycled 12th century and 13th century. These are in cairnstone, the upper ones. The lower one is mainly in Wealden sandstone. So you've got 2 sets of material, but it's all been recycled. I don't think any of these windows are in their original position or their original design. So the tower has got a little bit of a checkered history.
Was the building used for sort of defence? Like you said, the French raid from time to time. Did they use it as a lookout or anything?
Right. The answer was the building used for defence? There are examples of churches being used in a defensive manner. If you go to Guildford, St Mary's, what is now a central tower is in fact an Anglo-Saxon western tower dating from about 950, and that was at one of the gates into the Saxon Burh, the town founded by Alfred. You go to Oxford, and St Peter's, another Anglo-Saxon church tower, is at the north gate. There are examples where church buildings were used for defence. Go to Wareham, and the Anglo-Saxon church that still survives, I think it's St Lawrence, is right by one of the gates. It is unlikely this building was used for defence when this was built. It's too far away from the coast, and it's not defending anything. It's not defending a route through a pass, it's not defending a river. You go to somewhere like Newhaven, and there would have been a defensive property to any buildings built at that stage. Go a bit further up, again you've got other examples where you've got defensive buildings. But certainly the Normans in this part of the world are designing buildings in a different state, for different reasons. Sussex, as you know, is divided into north-south strips, the rapes. So you've got, in each of the rape there is a castle, Arundel being the most famous. Arundel defends the river, Bamburgh defends the river, they all defend rivers. So that's where the Normans are defending rather than the church buildings. Go into the north of England, Cumbria and Northumberland, it's a different story. Quite a lot of the towers in churches are defensive, and quite a lot of them have got the only opening at first floor level. So you could all run up a ladder, pull the ladder up behind you and sit there until the Scots had gone home and then come out again. And they had exactly the same the other side of the border. It was a way of defence. But no, this building hasn't got, as far as we know, a defensive role.
So, John, this is sad. I'm not sure if it's really true, but there was a navigable river, they say, the Wellesbourne,
right,
that runs underground now, and it may have been, and I don't know, that there was a river that came up here and you could actually get up it.
Yes. You've got to remember that rivers were a lot higher in the 11th century, and shallow bottom boats, basically small barges, were pulled by animals. So rivers were the main form of getting heavy materials around. If you ever go to Canterbury, its port was at Fordwich, so they could bring materials all the way to Fordwich, which is only about 1.5 miles from the cathedral, and then that was the only bit of overland they had to do. And certainly with great Anglo-Saxon churches, most of them are on rivers or on coasts. So in Kent we're very lucky, we've got 3 great Royal Saxon churches still surviving, all on the coast. Anybody who was anybody went by boat. You didn't go by horse or cart.
Can I take you back to the beginning?
Yep.
And can you just reiterate the north aisle, the north transept?
Yeah.
When did the original church have a north transept?
North aisle.
North aisle.
The short answer is I can't tell you that because the north wall of the older church has gone.
And you said that those carvings
Yes.
would have continued right along.
They would have continued right
Does
along.
that mean that the north wall of the church in the 13th century was there?
We don't know, because that carving, shall we say, is about 1130, 1140.
Right.
We know the south aisle has been added towards the end of the 12th century,
Right.
somewhere around about 1180, 1190. So we don't know. We don't know whether or not there was a north aisle. But in 1898, somebody had the good idea to knock the entire north wall of the church down to build that aisle. So we don't know whether it had both north and south aisles. All we know is it did have a south aisle.
Right, right. But the very original church would just have had one aisle where the main aisle of the church is now.
I have slight problem with original.
Well, let's say the 12th
The first,
century.
right, the first church, 11th century, just a nave, just a chancel.
Yeah.
We know by the end of the 12th century we got a south aisle.
Right,
We might have had a north aisle,
we don't know.
but we don't know.
Right, okay. But these carvings, when
These
they went
carvings
along,
are a little
would have
later.
predated that putative north aisle.
They would have predated that north aisle. Yes.
Gotcha.
There was somebody else shouting. Gentleman at the back.
Coins on this side, it's a redder sand. Is that as it was, or is it?
No, we've repointed, and I think it's got a lot to do with where the sun's coming from. So I think if you come early morning, you'll find that's probably lighter and darker on the other side as the sun comes round. One of the great things about particularly Wealden sandstone is it changes colour through the day as the sun goes round. So go to the great ironstone areas around Kent and North Sussex, you know, Horsmondon or all those great churches. You can start off at the East End and it's golden honey. By late afternoon it's almost white as the sun moves round. It changes colour. Lady in pink. Green, sorry.
You said you replaced some bricks. What stone did you use to replace things?
The answer was, what stone do we use to replace things? We replace like with like. So there has been 2 or 3 blocks of Cairn stone, which has come from Cairn, from the medieval mines, yes. In the 19th century, the mines weren't operating, and they were operating the quarries. And the quarries produce absolute rubbish. 19th century Cairn stone, on the whole, is not worth anything. At some point in the late 20th century, they got over the geological problem in the mines, and we're getting good quality Cairn stone from France. There are several people importing it. It can be a little bit problematic because our Gallic friends occasionally will impound it and say they want it for their work, even though you've paid for it. But don't go there. There are 2 quarries producing Wealden sandstone at the moment. So Wealden sandstone isn't the problem. You haven't got Kentish ragstone, but if you needed Kentish ragstone, we've got 2 quarries producing Kentish ragstone. There's plenty of quarries producing Bath stone. Most of the 19th century work is Bath stone. So finding the materials is not the problem at the present time. That's an interesting question. Was there a wooden structure here beforehand? I actually get quite annoyed about the idea that the Anglo-Saxons only built in timber. There are almost 500 Anglo-Saxon churches surviving in a substantial form. All but one of those is in masonry. Only one is in timber, and that's Greenstead Juxta Ongar on the Underground in Essex. It is the oldest timber church in the world, and it's in Essex. We know the Anglo-Saxons built in timber. We know the great royal halls were in timber. But wherever I come from in Kent, we have 2 of the 3 largest 7th century churches north of the Alps still surviving. The most famous is Milton Regis, which of course none of you have ever heard of. Built in 640. You would fit inside it and not touch the sides. Built of masonry. It is enormous. It was the royal church for the kings of Kent. It's near Sittingbourne. The royal halls may have been in timber, but the church was in stone. And just across the water is Minster on the Isle of Sheppey. That's a little bit later, about 670, 680, built by St Sexborough. Her sister founds Ely. All these great royal queens were founding these wonderful buildings. So in Kent we've got 3. We've got another one at Minster on the Isle of Thanet. 3 of these great 7th century churches. They are in stone. The largest churches north of the Alps in 1066 are in England. Winchester Cathedral was as big as Rochester Cathedral is today. So get out of your mind that the Saxons built in timber. They built in stone. They built enormous buildings in stone. The problem is we had a little bit of regime change in 1066, and what do all regimes do? They wipe out what has been there beforehand to reinforce their authority. So they go around sawing down these wonderful churches, which miraculously mainly caught fire. Canterbury catches fire in 1067, miraculously. So that's what happens. Canterbury was as big. Canterbury is about the same size as Rochester Cathedral is today. 300 feet long. These are big buildings. Lovely church. If you go to Buckinghamshire Wing, is a lovely one. Deerhurst is a lovely one. The biggest 7th century church north of the Alps is in Northamptonshire at Brixworth. It was so big they knocked the aisles off, called porticus, in the medieval period. But you can go and stand in the western gallery where King Offa used to stand, if you would like. He of Offa's Dyke, he who invented the penny, which has been the system of currency we've had for 1400 years. We're coming on to the third part, which is just showing you some quick illustrations of the work. While we're in here, you can see the arches of the South Aisle. And when we're finished, do have a wander around socially distanced. One of the lovely things you will notice is when you come through here, because we did a little bit of cleaning up, there are little 13th century roses being painted on the 11th century core stone. So, and they were something that we just gently uncovered. Right, I'm going to show you a few illustrations very quickly what we got up to. You may now struggle to remember what your tower looked like, encased in render. That's actually doing the sampling, trying to cut slots in to see how thick it was. That's when we got the shock. That's what you now look like, but 100 years ago, you were covered in ivy. So that's what happened over time. And that's the great thing about historic buildings. They do evolve over time. And there may be another meeting here in 100 years' time, and there's a new architect or surveyor, male, female, who knows? And they'll be saying, oh dear, that wretched Bailey, look what he did to this tower. Who knows? Next one. Right, just some quick illustrations, just to remind you what the building looked like. Absolutely featureless, covered in cement render. We've just cut a little slot, and that's on the eastern corner, southeast corner of the chancel, and that exposed one of the beautiful Wealden sandstone coins. That's when we thought, can we save them? And we were very lucky because Wealden sandstone is very soft. And so what had happened is that actually when we took the render off, we took a microscopic layer of Wealden sandstone off. It just separated off. And so in fact they have survived remarkably well, which is really good news. That great big lean-to buttress, you can't see any of the brickwork except one little bit sticking out. Everything is covered in an unbreathable concrete blanket for want of a better word. Okay? And here we are. We're starting to hack away, put it crudely. You can see, just starting on the tower, the operatives are just starting to hack away the thick renders. In fact, I am going to move, I'm going to get told off, I'm going to go like this. That is Roman cement. That is Portland cement. That is the original wall. And that is one of the tower windows. And as you can see, as we start to remove the material, the flint work is being exposed. We actually had to rebuild a lot of that flint work because the sheer action of getting the cement-based render off dislodged quite large areas. Okay. And here we are. We're starting now to get this material off. If you remember that big lean-to sloping buttress above the 12th century carving, there it is being exposed. Oh, I'll just get, there we are. There we are. And that was a huge surprise, seeing all that medieval Caen stone. Most of it surviving very well. So it shows that some point, probably in the 12th or early 13th century, somebody's spending quite a lot of money on this building. They're shipping this material in from France. That's not cheap. They're lugging it up from the coast, whether it's coming at Newhaven or whether or not they've just driven a little boat up onto the beach and then lugged it up the hill, we won't know. But there we are. There's a lot of work being undertaken to take the renders off, and then we're starting in the far picture to put the new lime pointing back. Some of that pointing is 3 inches thick, going back into the building to hold all the flint work back together. It's done in layers because you've got to let it carefully carbonate, carefully dry out, but you've got to keep wetting it because if it dries out too quickly, it will not carbonate, it will not set. And so it's a very skilled operation. It takes a long time. In fact, we had debris netting on so the sun wouldn't dry it out. If you get hard winds, we don't want those to dry it out. It's quite a skilled operation. Here you are. This is when we're taking the render off the south wall, and you can just see, that's the top of the 14th century window in the bottom of the picture, and just in the top left-hand corner you can see the curved arch of the robbed out aisle opening just starting to appear. That's when we thought there was something odd going on. And in fact, I haven't got a photograph of it, but we're pretty sure we found the outline of at least one 11th century window opening. Completely robbed out, but somewhere in that wall we may have an 11th century window opening. We haven't gone looking for it. That's not the purpose of what we're trying to do. We're trying to conserve and repair what we've got. And then, of course, we started to find these on the outside. Those are the chalk Vooswell stones. Vooswell stones are the stones that make up an arch above me. And those are in chalk. That's quite a common building material in the 12th and 13th century. It's absolutely fine to build with if you haven't got it exposed to the elements. It's good enough for wall cores, for leaving arches over other openings as long as it's internal. It doesn't like being outside particularly, but nevertheless it's fine. You can see above the chalkwork the big flints, below the chalkwork the smaller infill flints from the 14th century. Right, this is what we were ending up with. Quite a thick, deep repointing. It's almost like a base coat of render. We had a long discussion with Historic England, the Darton Advisory Committee, and a number of other people. Should we re-render this building? The answer we came up with was no. We looked at other examples locally. Patcham, for instance, has been deeply repointed. I'm not sure about the mix, but we won't go there. This gives us, all the joints are filled up, all the voids are filled up. We also grouted these walls with lime grout. We drilled holes at 450 centres, flushed out the voids, and then let gravity take a lime grout to fill all the voids. So we were sticking the whole walls back together. We then deeply repoint. This is our weathering surface. None of us here will have to worry about these walls. It'll be a good 2 or 3 generations' time before they have to do any more work on this building, at least I hope. And as you can see on the belfry opening, we had to replace some of the arched openings because the cementitious renders had completely destroyed some of the stonework. And that's a new piece of Caen stone from France on that little opening. As you can see, a little 12th century opening, but it's now high level in the tower. So it's been reused from somewhere else. Okay, Andy? Here's the tower. You can see quite a bit of patching in brickwork. You can see the Wealden sandstone coins all coming up. We took a risk. We had got a contingency. If the coin stones on the corner hadn't survived, we did have permission to re-render your tower, because putting new coin stones on was prohibitively expensive. But miraculously, I think we've replaced 3, 4, something like that. Very, very few. The render came straight off them, and now they can perform the role they should be doing, which is reinforcing the corner. Andy? And here we are. This is just before we'd finished. You can see there's a fantastic tide mark. You've got the upper walls are repointed, lower walls haven't been repointed because that's obviously where the scaffolding and the hoarding was. And now the scaffolding's been removed and the masons are coming back to repoint the lower areas of the walls. But it makes a huge difference to the building. It's looking closer to what it might have looked like 500 or 600 years ago. We won't know if your building was fully rendered or not. And then the interior. We removed all the hard renders from the internal wall on the south side and in the chancel. In some places, that render was up to 3 inches thick. I'll show you how thick it was. This bit of this monument wasn't visible. And that goes for the surround of the oval monument. That wasn't visible. The surround of the monument above wasn't visible. And so on and so on. They had completely encased the interior of this wall. Once that came off, we have been able to render in a lime render 3-coat work, and the decision was taken to leave the columns and the arches where they exist exposed so people could understand the history of the building. Not strictly conservation policy nowadays. We would have probably have covered them up, but it was the parish's decision, and I think the right decision, because people now understand the sequencing of this building. And we didn't want to be in another position in another 100 years' time when they take the render off and say, oh, look, it had a south aisle, didn't know that. So people can now read the story. They can read the story of an 11th century wall, arches cut through it, shall we say 1190, filling in about 1360, 1370. That wall has a really exciting history, and it's great that everybody now knows about it. Ladies and gentlemen, I have bored you enough. I am sure you are itching to get at the wine and the nibbles again. Very happy to answer any questions, and please do explore this most wonderful building. We are very fortunate in this country. We have a wonderful range of medieval churches, a far greater variety of church buildings than anywhere else in Europe, and we don't celebrate it enough. And yes, Patcham isn't a great cathedral, it isn't a great monastery, it doesn't matter. This is the most important building in Patcham. She's a lovely old lady, she has outlasted generations, and she will continue to outlast generations as long as we all care for her. Whether you come for worship or not, this is part of your heritage. So please do support the Friends, and it'd be great to think in 100 years' time there'll be another architect surveyor standing here explaining to another group of Patcham residents, Patchamites, whatever you call yourself, about this wonderful building. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Is this working? Sorry. Thanks for that, John. I don't know about anybody else here. I've learnt shed loads today, and I'm sure a lot of us are quite proud to have a building that is probably one of the oldest in Brighton, if not the oldest.
It may well be the oldest in Brighton, yes.
Yeah. But so thanks very much for your chat, and thanks very much for all the work you put in for us over the last few years. It's been great. It's been a pleasure working with you. And I know we're just presenting you with a little gift.
Oh, thank you.
And a card.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you.